The moment the three little girls pressed their palms against his table, and whispered, "Please, just for 5 minutes pretend you're our father." Daniel Harper felt something inside his chest crack open, in a way it hadn't since the night he buried his wife. Because no stranger asks a man that unless fear has already chased them to the edge of something unbearable. He had been sitting alone in the corner of the old tea café, steam rising from a chipped porcelain cup, the kind of place where time moved slowly and grief could sit beside you without being noticed, when their shadows fell across his table, like a sudden eclipse. 3 identical faces, same dark eyes too alert for their age, same trembling lips trying to be brave, same hands gripping one another as if letting go would make them disappear. Daniel's first instinct was to stand up, to look around for a parent, a guardian, anyone who should have been there instead of him, but the cafe felt strangely silent. Like the world had leaned back to watch what he would do next. He noticed everything in a rush that made his heart pound, the way the girls' clothes were clean but worn thin at the elbows. The way one of them had a faint bruise near her wrist, that someone had tried to hide with a bracelet. The way all 3 kept glancing over their shoulders toward the entrance where a man in a dark jacket stood pretending to scroll on his phone, while watching them far too closely. Daniel swallowed hard, his throat suddenly dry, because he recognized that look. It was the same look he used to scan playgrounds when his son was younger, the look of a parent counting seconds, measuring danger. He opened his mouth to say he wasn't the right person, that he was just a single dad trying to survive the quiet after loss, but the smallest of the girls leaned closer. Her voice barely louder than the clink of a spoon, and said, "He thinks we don't have anyone." And that was the sentence that changed everything. Daniel's hand, almost without permission, moved across the table, palm open, a silent invitation. The girls slipped into the empty chairs as if they had rehearsed it, shoulders straightening, eyes softening. Fear folding itself into something that looked like hope. "Hey," Daniel said, forcing warmth into his voice, the same tone he used when his son scraped a knee and pretended not to cry. "You're late. I was wondering when my daughters would show up." The word daughters tasted strange and heavy, but the effect was instant. The man by the door stiffened, glanced at them again, then looked away. One of the girls let out a breath so shaky, it almost sounded like a sob. And another reached under the table to grab Daniel's knee, her fingers small and freezing through the fabric of his jeans. For 5 minutes, Daniel played a role he didn't know he still remembered how to perform. He scolded them gently for interrupting his tea, asked about school, complained about homework, and when the waitress came over, he ordered pastries without asking, the way a father does when he already knows the answer. The girls nodded along, murmuring replies. Their voices growing steadier with every second, their eyes finally leaving the door. But Daniel could feel the weight behind their act, the unspoken story pressing against his ribs. Because children don't cling to strangers unless they've learned the world can turn dangerous without warning. When the man finally left, pushing the café door open with a sharp motion, all 3 girls sagged at once, the performance collapsing like a stage curtain after the final line. The middle one, who seemed older by only a few minutes but carried herself like a guardian, looked straight at Daniel and said, "Thank you. He follows us when we walk home from school. Today he tried to talk to us." Daniel felt heat flood his ears. A quiet rage rising that scared him with its intensity. He asked where their parents were, already dreading the answer, and the girls exchanged a look so practiced it told him this question came up often. "Our mom works late," the smallest one said. "Sometimes she doesn't come home until morning." Daniel nodded slowly, even as his mind raced, calculating streets, distances, risks, the way he had learned to do after becoming both mother and father to his own child. He stood up, pushing his chair back, and said the words that surprised even him. "I'll walk you home." They hesitated, just for a heartbeat, then nodded together, a synchronized motion that made Daniel's chest ache. As they stepped outside into the cooling evening, the city lights flickering on like cautious stars, Daniel realized this was no longer about pretending. Whatever had brought those girls to his table had pulled him into a story already in motion. One that would not let him return to his quiet cup of tea, or his carefully managed loneliness. He didn't know yet that this walk would expose secrets far darker than a man in a cafe, or that kindness, once offered, has a way of demanding more than you ever planned to give. But as 3 small hands slipped into his, Daniel understood one thing with terrifying clarity. 5 minutes had turned into something that would change all of their lives. The walk to their apartment was quiet at first, filled only with the soft echo of their shoes on the wet pavement, and the occasional distant honk of cars that blurred into the background, like they didn't matter anymore. Daniel kept his eyes on the street, scanning the shadows, the corners, the flickering streetlights, as though danger might rise from anywhere. But the girls didn't pull their hands away. Instead, they pressed closer, the smallest one burrowing into his side, as if seeking warmth from a stranger who somehow felt safer than anyone they'd known. Daniel's chest tightened at that sight. He had been alone in grief for months, teaching himself to survive without her, without the softness of a mother or the chaos of a full family around him. Yet now, with these 3 girls clinging to him, he felt the sudden, frightening stirrings of responsibility, not just responsibility, but a kind of fear-tinged hope. A chance that his broken world might somehow stitch itself into something bigger again. When they reached the small apartment building, it sat in a quiet street, peeling paint on the balconies. Faint smells of home cooking wafting from open windows, yet Daniel could sense the tension behind the door. They didn't run ahead, they waited for him to open the gate, their faces lined with caution. Trust still unproven. As the elevator carried them up, the smallest one leaned her forehead against his shoulder and whispered, "Do you think maybe you could stay?" Daniel's fingers tightened around hers instinctively, a reflex he didn't even recognize as his own desire. He wanted to say yes, wanted to promise safety and comfort, but his voice caught somewhere in the hollow of his chest. He swallowed and said instead, "I'll make sure you get there safely first. Then we'll see." The door opened to a small apartment, cluttered with toys, worn-out books, and clothes hanging over chairs like silent witnesses of a life constantly in motion. There was no sign of a mother waiting with open arms, only the faint hum of a television in the other room. The girls led him through the hallway, past photographs taped to the walls, smiling pictures of themselves with a woman he guessed was their mother, and a man with a face he didn't recognize. There was a tenderness in the way the photos were arranged, almost as if they were trying to remember happiness, trying to hold on to it even when it felt distant. Daniel kneeled down to their level and asked softly, "Is he gone now? The man who follows you?" They nodded, and the middle one, the most composed, whispered, "He left but sometimes he comes back. We don't know when." The weight of that statement hung in the air like a storm cloud. Daniel's mind raced. He thought about his own child sleeping in the next room at home. About the nights he stayed awake to guard against nightmares, about the promises he made to himself after tragedy struck. Never again would he feel powerless while someone he loved was in danger. He straightened, taking a deep breath, feeling the familiar shift in his spine, the shift from a man surviving to a man protecting. He didn't realize he had begun scanning the apartment like a security professional, noting exit routes, the locks on windows, the sounds that might signal trouble. The girls noticed, and for the first time their faces relaxed. "You're like a real father," the oldest one said almost shyly. The word struck Daniel harder than any accusation or compliment ever could. A real father. The phrase lodged itself in his chest and pressed against the cavity left by grief, and for a moment, he allowed himself to imagine it, laughing at breakfast with 3 girls, wiping tears off scraped knees, walking them to school on a chilly morning, hearing their small voices calling out his name. It was dangerous, that imagination, because it felt too good to be true. Yet it was the first warmth he had felt in months. Dinner that night was a quiet affair. Daniel didn't know what they usually ate, so he made sandwiches and heated milk, trying to keep the conversation light while letting them guide the rhythm of the meal. They told him stories of school, of classmates who teased them for being triplets, of small victories and secret dreams. Their laughter was cautious at first, tentative, but as the minutes passed, it grew, blossoming into something he hadn't heard in his own home for a long time. The sound of unguarded joy. Daniel listened, his heart a mixture of awe and heartbreak, because he knew just how fragile that joy was, how easily it could be shattered by the man who lurked outside, by the harsh realities of a life these girls had been forced into. Later, after they brushed their teeth and settled into the small living room with blankets and stuffed animals, one of the girls tugged at his sleeve. "Can you tell us a story?" she asked. Daniel looked at them, their eyes bright with trust, with hope, and felt the first real surge of belonging in months. He told a story, the kind he used to tell his own son when the nights were long and shadows crept into corners. He made up names of ventures, small triumphs against impossible odds. He spoke of kindness, of courage, of never giving up even when the world seemed to have turned against you. And as he spoke, the girls leaned closer, their heads almost touching his shoulders, and for the first time, he realized that the act of pretending, of stepping into this role, had become something far more profound. It wasn't pretending anymore. It was real. When he finally left that night, walking the empty streets back to his own apartment, Daniel felt a strange mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. His grief felt heavier because he had allowed hope to touch it again. But his heart felt fuller than it had in months. The city was quiet, the streetlights flickering like tentative stars, and he could still feel the warmth of small hands in his own. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. Didn't know if the man who had been following the girls would return. Didn't know if he could truly become the father they needed. But for the first time since his wife had died, he believed that kindness, simple, courageous, dangerous kindness, could change everything. The next morning, Daniel woke to a strange emptiness in his apartment. For a moment, he thought he had dreamed it all, the girls, the whispers, the hands in his. But then his phone buzzed, a message from the middle girl. "Are you coming today? We need you." He stared at it, the words simple, yet they carried a weight that made his chest tighten. He dressed quickly, grabbed his keys and left, feeling the city shift around him. The streets were the same, yet everything seemed sharper, as if his senses had recalibrated to notice the shadows that might threaten those small lives. He rehearsed in his mind what he would say, what he could do, but he knew the truth: there were no rehearsals for this. Every decision, every word, could mean safety, or danger. When he arrived at the apartment building, the girls ran to him before he could even knock, faces bright with relief and something else he couldn't name at first: fear, urgency, anticipation. "As here," the oldest one said, her voice trembling. Daniel's stomach sank. The man had returned. He felt the familiar burn of rage, but he forced it down, replacing it with calm calculation. He knelt to their level, looking into their eyes. "We're going to be careful today. Okay? No sudden moves, trust me." They nodded, their small hands gripping his once again. Daniel felt an almost painful surge of protectiveness. These weren't just children, they were tiny worlds he had been entrusted with, fragile and brilliant and terrifyingly vulnerable. They made their way down the street, the girls whispering directions to a small park a few blocks away. Daniel scanned every corner, every alley, noting the shadows, the parked cars, the strangers. The man had been following them yesterday, but today, Daniel would not allow it. He positioned himself between the girls and a potential threat, his presence a silent barrier. When the man appeared at a distance, lurking behind a tree, Daniel's heart hammered. But he remained calm. He didn't shout. He didn't panic. Instead, he led the girls in a zigzag pattern, staying in well-lit areas, keeping them moving, keeping them safe. The man hesitated, watching frustrated, but there was no confrontation. Daniel had learned that courage isn't always in fighting. It's in protecting, in outsmarting danger quietly and efficiently. At the park, they found a small, secluded bench near the edge of a pond. The girls sat close, leaning against him, their small bodies shaking slightly as the tension of the morning began to ebb. Daniel took a deep breath, letting the warmth of their presence wash over him. "Why me?" he asked quietly, almost to himself. "Why come to me?" The smallest one looked up at him, tears glistening in her wide eyes. "Because you cared yesterday, you listened. You didn't tell us to go away. You didn't," her voice faltered. "You didn't act like it's our fault." Daniel felt the weight of those words. They weren't just seeking a father. They were seeking proof that someone could be safe. That someone could love them without judgment or expectation. That someone could be their anchor in a world that often seemed too cruel for their age. He spent the afternoon with them, playing simple games, telling stories, letting them climb on his back, laugh, and forget, if only for a while, the dangers that lurked beyond the park. For Daniel, every laugh, every small hand in his, was a reminder of the stakes, a reminder of the beauty and fragility of life. And yet, amid the joy, he sensed the shadows lingering. The man's presence, though distant, was still a threat. Daniel's mind worked tirelessly, calculating paths home, exit strategies, ways to ensure that whatever awaited them at the apartment would be met with strength and preparation. He knew instinctively that this was just the beginning. Protecting them was not a single act, it was a commitment, a series of moments strung together that demanded vigilance, courage, and an almost impossible patience. When it was time to return to the apartment, Daniel insisted on walking them home. The streets seemed quieter, but he knew better than to let his guard down. The girls sensed his tension but trusted it, following closely, letting him lead. As they approached the building, the man's shadow flickered briefly near the entrance. Daniel stepped forward, positioning himself between the girls and the threat, his body tense but composed. "Stay behind me," he said softly, and they obeyed. The man hesitated, assessing Daniel, realizing perhaps that he had underestimated this man's quiet, resolute strength. Finally, he turned and disappeared into the street, and Daniel felt a slow exhale of relief pass through him. Back in the apartment, the girls relaxed, their faces bright with the fragile safety they had longed for. Daniel watched them, sitting cross-legged on the floor, playing a game he didn't understand but played anyway, laughing along. And then the mother appeared, tired, disheveled, guilt-ridden, apologizing for the neglect, the absence, the dangers she couldn't control. Daniel felt anger rise at first, but it softened when he saw her tears, when he saw the love she clearly still held for her daughters. He realized that kindness sometimes required more than just protection, it required understanding, patience, the willingness to see brokenness without turning away. That night, as Daniel walked back to his own apartment, he felt something shift in himself. The grief he had carried for months, the hollow ache left by his wife's absence, now shared space with a new purpose. A new thread of connection. These girls, strangers who had needed him, had awakened something he had thought was lost forever, the courage to care deeply, to step into danger for the sake of love. To trust that kindness could indeed ripple outward, even when it came at a personal cost. He didn't yet know what the future held, didn't yet know if he would become their father, but he knew this. Some bonds are forged not through blood, but through the act of showing up when it matters most. And today he had shown up. The following week felt like a blur of quiet chaos and unexpected warmth. Daniel began arriving at the apartment every morning before school, helping the girls get dressed, preparing breakfast, and making sure their shoes were tied and coats zipped snugly. Each day was a delicate balance, laughter mixed with anxiety, small victories shadowed by the lingering threat of the man who had followed them. Yet, in the midst of it, Daniel discovered a rhythm he hadn't known he could have again. He found himself humming as he poured cereal, gently reminding the smallest one to brush her teeth, teasing the middle one when she tried to argue over wearing a pink scarf, and holding the oldest's hand as they walked the long corridor to the street. It wasn't perfect. It was messy, chaotic, sometimes terrifying. But it was alive, and it was real. One afternoon, as Daniel helped with homework at the kitchen table, he noticed the smallest one staring at him with a mixture of curiosity and fear. Do you have a family?" she asked quietly. Daniel paused, his pen frozen mid-air. He could have told her he was alone, that the weight of grief had consumed his life, that he had only his son and the shadows of memory for company. But something in her gaze, so raw, so honest, made him reconsider. "I do," he said slowly. "I have someone very special, and I lost someone I loved very much." The words came with a bitter taste, but they also carried a seed of hope, a reminder that love could exist even after loss. The girl's lips pressed together, and for a moment, she seemed to understand, as if the depth of his sorrow and care were transparent, visible in the lines of his face and the gentleness of his voice. The days began to stretch longer. Daniel discovered small things about each girl. The smallest one loved drawing, filling her notebooks with fantastical creatures. The middle one had an incredible memory for stories and facts, reciting entire chapters from books she adored. The oldest had a quiet leadership, often making decisions for the group and comforting the others when they faltered. Daniel marveled at their resilience, their bravery, and yet he also saw the cracks, the exhaustion hidden behind forced smiles. It became his mission to repair those cracks, even if only slightly, even if only for fleeting moments. He found himself staying later, leaving only when the mother returned, ensuring that each girl had a warm bath, a meal in her stomach, and a sense of safety before he departed into the cold evening streets. Then came the night that changed everything. Daniel had just finished tucking the girls into bed, the soft hum of the apartment comforting against the distant city noise. As he turned to leave, he heard a faint knock at the door. His heart froze. Every instinct screamed that it was the man, back again. He crept to the peephole, barely breathing. Outside stood the mother, her eyes wide, panic written across her face. She held a crumpled piece of paper in her hands. "Daniel, you have to help us. I don't know who else to turn to." His hands shook as he opened the door, and she thrust the paper into his grip. It was a note, messy, hurried, filled with threats directed at the girls. Daniel's stomach dropped. The man was planning something more, something terrifying. Without a word he ushered the mother inside, sitting her down at the kitchen table. "Tell me everything," he said, his voice calm but edged with steel. She spilled it all, the harassment, the following, the escalating threats, the nights she had spent in terror. Daniel listened, absorbing the weight of her fear and guilt, realizing that this was no longer a simple act of kindness. It was a fight for survival, and the lives of these girls now rested in his hands, just as they always had in those brief moments in the café. He formulated a plan in his head, meticulously, like he had done when protecting his son. He would not allow fear to paralyze them. He would act, and he would ensure that safety wasn't a temporary gift, it would be a shield. The next day, Daniel took the girls to school himself, careful to choose routes that were unpredictable, teaching them subtle ways to notice danger, ways to stay alert without fear overtaking their small hearts. Every step was measured, every glance purposeful. Yet, amidst the tension, there was laughter, soft and hesitant, but growing. They trusted him, and that trust was both a burden and a gift. He felt it acutely, like a weight on his shoulders that also lifted him, a strange paradox. He realized that kindness wasn't passive, it wasn't simply giving a cup of tea or a comforting word. It was active, demanding courage, vigilance, sacrifice. And as he watched the girls walk into the school gates, their small faces turned back to him in waves. Daniel understood that the world could be cruel, yes, but it could also be beautiful in the hands of someone brave enough to show up. That evening, he returned to the apartment to find the girls waiting. The mother pacing nervously. Daniel knelt down to speak to the girls, who crowded around him. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. "No matter what, I'll be here for you. You're safe." Their eyes glistened, a mixture of tears and relief, and for a fleeting moment, the apartment was filled with something powerful, hope. Daniel realized then that he had become more than a protector. He had become a father, in ways that went beyond biology, beyond obligation, beyond chance. He had become a beacon, a proof that kindness, when wielded with courage, could transform lives, could forge connections that destiny itself had not planned. As he left that night, walking back through the quiet city streets, Daniel allowed himself to smile. The fear hadn't vanished, nor the danger. But for the first time in a long time he felt alive, connected and capable of love again, not the cautious, hesitant love he had carried since his wife's death, but a full, fierce, unwavering love that refused to be limited by circumstance. He understood that life's tragedies could be mitigated by courage, by presence, by unwavering care. And above all, he knew that one small act of kindness, the choice to sit with strangers, to listen, to protect, had already set in motion a chain of events that would bind their lives together in ways no one could have anticipated. The following weeks blurred into a rhythm of courage, love, and careful vigilance. Daniel found himself completely entwined in the girls' lives, and in turn, their lives became inseparable from his. Each morning he woke before sunrise, preparing breakfast, ensuring uniforms were neat, hair combed, lunches packed. Every step was a silent pledge no harm would reach them while he drew breath. And though his some small voice sometimes called him home, Daniel knew he could no longer divide himself. These girls had become a part of him, just as he had become theirs. The bond was no longer forged from pretense, it was real, raw and unshakable. The threat of the man still lingered, always at the edge of their awareness, but Daniel refused to let fear dominate their days. He taught the girls small strategies, how to notice strangers, how to stick together, how to ask for help without shame. And yet, he balanced these lessons with laughter, with warmth, with tiny adventures that filled the apartment with noise and joy. They baked cookies together, decorating them with mismatched sprinkles. They built pillow forts and held impromptu storytelling nights. Daniel inventing tales of bravery and kindness that made them giggle until their stomachs hurt. Through it all, Daniel realized that the greatest acts of heroism were often simple: showing up, listening, holding a hand, creating a safe world in the midst of chaos. One night, after tucking them in, Daniel stayed behind to talk with the mother. She had grown quieter in his presence. Her exhaustion etched deeper into her face. Yet, she looked at him with gratitude so profound it made his chest ache. I don't know how to thank you," she said, voice barely above a whisper. Daniel shook his head. "You don't need to. These girls deserve someone who will be there. That's all that matters." She reached out, briefly holding his hand. a silent acknowledgement of the trust and hope he had earned. He could see the relief in her eyes, the recognition that someone willing to protect and love these children had entered their lives. And perhaps, for the first time in years, they could breathe without fear. It was during one ordinary evening, a rare calm in their turbulent lives, that Daniel finally allowed himself to notice the change within himself. He was sitting in the living room, the girls sprawled around him, drawing and reading, while soft music played in the background. His hands felt steady, his heart full. The grief that had once consumed him still lingered, but it had transformed, softened by purpose, by care, by the undeniable joy of being needed and giving himself completely. For the first time since his wife's death, he felt something approaching peace, not the hollow kind, but a deep, vibrant peace born from love, courage, and the realization that even the smallest acts of kindness can ripple outward to change lives entirely. Weeks later, the threat finally dissolved. The man stopped appearing, the notes ceased, and the shadows that had haunted their days retreated into memory. But by then, the lives of Daniel and the three girls had been irreversibly entwined. The apartment, once quiet and fearful, became alive with laughter, arguments, bedtime stories, and small triumphs. Daniel discovered that love wasn't always announced in grand gestures. It was in presence, in patience, in showing up consistently, even when no one could see. He became their father in every sense that mattered, and in doing so, the world had quietly healed a corner of his own broken heart. One evening, as they all sat together watching the sunset through the apartment window, the middle girl leaned against his shoulder and whispered, "Thank you for being our dad, even if it started as pretend." Daniel felt tears prick his eyes. He kissed the top of her head, holding back a wave of emotion. "I'm not pretending anymore," he said softly. And in that moment, Daniel understood the profound truth that had carried him through grief, fear, and uncertainty. Kindness has a way of finding those who need it most, and when you embrace it fully, it transforms not just the lives of others, but your own. As night fell and the city lights blinked alive, Daniel looked around at the small, joyful chaos of the apartment, three little faces smiling, laughter echoing off the walls, a mother learning to trust again. He realized that life's harshest storms can sometimes lead to the brightest dawns. One simple act of kindness, the choice to sit with strangers, to protect and love, had reshaped destiny itself. And in that small apartment, amidst blankets, drawings, and tiny shoes lined by the door, Daniel Harper found what he had thought impossible: a family reborn, hearts mended, and the quiet, steady power of unwavering love.